The train lurched forward, with a deafening screech, its metal body groaning as if it knew the dark secret it carried. Passengers sat oblivious, unaware of the invisible hand that was slowly tightening its grip around their fates. Felix Arkwright stood at the edge of the engine room, his mind racing. What had started as a simple mystery was spiraling into something far more dangerous. Someone, or something, was using the train to disappear people, and the only thing more terrifying than the unknown was the machine that was running it. As the hum of the device grew louder, Felix realized one chilling truth: by the time they reached their destination, it might be too late to stop the chaos already set in motion. Felix Arkwright had absolutely no patience left for idiocy. Not after spending 21 grueling days chasing a jewel thief who slithered through London like smoke, vanishing into the murk of its foulest pubs, and reappearing like a ghost in the cracked mirrors of seedy bathroom stalls. He was bone-weary, soul-sore, and one heartbeat away from throttling the next person who so much as breathed in his direction. All he wanted was a moment of peace, a soft seat, a sandwich that hadn't been touched by crime or chaos, and maybe a pocket of silence where nobody was plotting to stab him in the ribs. That's why the midnight departure of the Belford Express felt less like a luxury train, and more like a lifeline dangling from the heavens. With its golden fixtures, velvet furnishings, and whispered promises of elegance, it radiated the one thing Felix craved above all: order. As he stepped aboard, the porter barely masked his distaste, eyes drifting over Felix's weather-beaten trench coat, the permanent grim line of his mouth, and the aura of someone who'd seen too many bodies in too many alleys. "First class, sir?" the porter asked, skepticism sharp as a blade, as if Felix had stumbled in from a parallel world. "Unless you've got a detective's cabin next to the coal room," Felix muttered, brushing past with a weary flick of his hat before the man could summon more judgment. Inside, the Belford Express gleamed like a chandelier turned inside out, brass polished to a glow, carpets plush enough to drown in, and passengers wrapped in silk and self-importance, sipping tea like it was holy water. As Felix passed the dining car, fragments of hushed conversations floated through the air like whispered warnings. Experimental design, never tested before. Harold was a fool to bring that thing aboard. Felix didn't pause, but his detective's instinct filed the words away, etching them beneath his fatigue. Moments later, he collapsed into his compartment like a man settling into the eye of a storm, pulling his hat low, and surrendering to the rhythmic clatter of the train, a lullaby of steel and shadows. But the peace didn't last. It never did. A scream tore through the carriage like a jagged knife, high-pitched, raw, and filled with the kind of terror that can't be faked. Felix was on his feet in a breath, moving through the corridor like a shadow. Passengers peeked from their doors, drawn by fear and morbid curiosity, their faces pale, eyes wide. The sound had come from compartment 7. A cluster of luxury luggage outside the door hinted at a wealthy occupant, and the name Madame Burgard had been mentioned in passing earlier, her presence as opulent as her perfume. The conductor arrived, panting and rattled, fumbling with keys as if the lock itself were resisting him. "Madame Burgard, are you unharmed?" Silence answered. The key turned. The door creaked open. The compartment was empty. No blood, no struggle, just a coat tossed carelessly across the seat, a half-drunk champagne glass still fizzing delicately, and the unmistakable sense that someone had been there moments before and then wasn't. Felix's steps were slow, deliberate. As he entered, the air smelled faintly of jasmine, and something else, something metallic. The seat was warm. That fact alone screamed that the disappearance had occurred within the last minute. And then he saw it, a small oily black smear on the window latch, untouched by the conductor or any of the gathering onlookers. Felix crouched, fingertips brushing it, rubbing it between his fingers as a strange trail caught his eye. Thin wisps of steam curling along the floorboards like spectral snakes, vanishing into the cold. The window itself was locked from the inside. No way out. And yet, she was gone. "I'd say she stepped out for a smoke," Felix muttered, "but I think she'd have used the door for that." His eyes narrowed. This wasn't a vanishing. It was a performance, one designed with precision, theatrics, and just enough strangeness to bend reality. The conductor was already trying to pacify the guests with hollow words, the kind of scripted reassurances that meant nothing. But Felix wasn't listening. He was calculating. Whatever had happened here wasn't spontaneous. It was orchestrated, and somewhere on this train was the hand pulling the strings. His shoulders squared, and his stomach growled with hunger and irritation. So much for the sandwich. By morning the train was buzzing like a hive poked with a stick. The dining car was thick with tension. Passengers whispered in theatrical tones, spinning ghost stories over half-eaten breakfasts. "I swear I saw steam coming from under her door," one woman said, eyes wide with fear and delight. "It's the phantom killer, I tell you," another muttered. Felix said nothing, but inside, something had clicked into place. Something about that steam, that smear, that absence of any sign of escape. It wasn't just a disappearance, it was an opening act. The show had begun, and someone aboard the Belford Express was turning murder into a spectacle. Wrapped in a heavy fur coat that looked more appropriate for an Arctic expedition than a luxury train ride, an elderly woman leaned toward Felix and whispered with unnerving calm, "It's the phantom, dear. He takes them when the steam rises." Felix, who had reached the edge of his tolerance for ghost stories, sometime around 2 a.m., let out a sharp snort. "Right. Phantom killer. Let me guess. He rides a ghost carriage and snacks on invisible hors d'oeuvres." His sarcasm earned a hard stare from a nearby porter, a look that practically screamed, "You'll regret mocking the ghost." Felix sighed, pinched the bridge of his nose, and muttered under his breath, "Wonderful. I'm knee-deep in steam-powered hauntings. What's next? A séance with the ticket stubs." He shoved his hands into his coat, and marched toward the passenger compartments, resigned to the grim task of interviewing witnesses, who all seemed to be in competition for the most absurd theory. The first was a jittery man with round glasses, and the breathless enthusiasm of someone who had never been taken seriously in his life. "I heard humming," he exclaimed. "Like bees. Angry ones." Felix blinked. "Bees?" he repeated, pencil hovering above his notebook. "Yes, absolutely swarming with menace." Felix scratched out the note before he even finished writing it. The next interview wasn't much better. A well-dressed woman from compartment 9 leaned in as if revealing a sacred secret. "I didn't hear bees," she said, eyes gleaming, "but I definitely smelled smoke." Felix perked up. Finally, something grounded. "Could you tell where it came from?" She nodded solemnly. "Oh yes, the bathroom." Felix's hopes lifted a notch. "Did you see anything else?" She leaned closer. "I think the phantom may have eaten something bad. Possibly fish." Felix stared at her for a long beat before walking off mid-sentence. The absurdity only escalated with each interview. One man insisted the ghost wore a hat. Another claimed it carried a briefcase. "Great," Felix muttered. "A ghost with a 9 to 5 and an expense report." Frustrated, he decided to explore the rear of the train, where the shadows grew darker, and the whispers died out. That's when he saw it. The carriage no one mentioned. It wasn't marked, wasn't luxurious, just a matte black car clinging to the train's end like a secret. 2 guards flanked the door, stiff as statues in long coats. "Gentlemen," Felix said, nodding with false cheer. "Mind if I poke around?" The taller guard didn't blink. "Yes, we do mind. Come now." Felix grinned. "I promise not to tamper with your experimental ghost trap/vacuum cleaner." The second guard's mustache twitched. "I'm joking. Mostly," Felix added. "Passengers are not allowed inside," the taller one said flatly. "Of course," Felix muttered, backing off with hands raised. "But I'll bet 5 to 1 that whatever's in there is eating our guests." The guard shared a look, nervous, tight-lipped, but said nothing. "Right," Felix said, turning away. "So it is happening. We're just pretending it's not." Before they could respond, another scream ripped through the train like a siren. Felix sprinted back to the lounge, where passengers were swarming around compartment 12. The door wouldn't budge. The conductor arrived, fumbling with keys, as though they were coated in oil. Locked from the inside, I presume. Felix deadpanned. The conductor shot him a glare but said nothing. When the door finally opened, it revealed a chilling echo of the earlier scene. No passenger, no struggle, just a faint trail of black soot across the lush carpet, and steam curling ghost-like in the air, evaporating slowly. Felix stepped in, ran a finger through the soot, and muttered, "At this point, I'm half convinced this train is carnivorous." As the murmurs behind him grew louder and more fearful, Felix knew one thing with grim certainty. Whatever was happening here wasn't a haunting. It was a design, a meticulously executed illusion meant to bend reason and reality. And if he didn't figure out how it worked soon, the Belford Express would reach its final stop with no one left aboard to tell the tale. Felix had barely let out a groan about haunted bees and ghostly indigestion, when a whisper-soft rustle at the door snapped him to alert. An unmarked envelope slid beneath it like a silent threat from the shadows. He bent to retrieve it, tearing it open without ceremony. The paper inside was creased, and smelled faintly of oil and soot. "Stay out of it, detective, or you'll be next." A slow smile curved across Felix's face. "Now that's more like it," he muttered, tucking the note into his coat, as though it were a cherished letter from an old friend. Still smirking, he leaned back in his seat, muttering, "Next time, I'm taking the bus." But rest was a lie, and sleep had no place here. Not when threats arrived folded and cryptic, not when locked doors guarded forbidden truths. Felix had a rule. The more determined someone was to keep a door shut, the more determined he was to open it. And a death threat, that was practically an engraved invitation. The train hissed beneath him like a living thing as he rose and moved down the corridor, the soft clunk of his boots muffled by velvet carpeting. The ghost carriage loomed ahead, still matte black, still ominous, but now unguarded. Either someone had grown careless, or something worse had come calling. "Fortune favors the idiotic," Felix muttered as he knelt by the lock. From his pocket, he produced his most loyal companion, a crooked hairpin lifted from a cafe months ago, now more reliable than most friends. It took finesse, a bit of whispered bribery to the tumblers, and a very quiet curse, but eventually the lock slid open. Inside, the air buzzed with static tension, the sort that hummed in your bones and made your skin itch. This wasn't a carriage, it was a cathedral of chaos, a steampunk fever dream, with copper wires tangled like vines and machines that blinked, beeped, and belched strange pulses of light. In the center stood a monstrosity that could have been a generator, a reactor, or perhaps the nervous system of a god. A swirling core of glowing blue energy pulsed like a heartbeat trapped in brass and glass. Felix stepped in, hypnotized. This looks like it could collapse the laws of nature by accident, or on purpose," he whispered. A throat cleared behind him. Felix didn't turn. "Let me guess. Step away from the machine," he said, exasperated. "Yes," actually came a shaky voice. Spinning, Felix found himself face to face with a man who looked like a nervous librarian, had been force-fed an engineer's uniform, thin, pale, and clutching a wrench like a toddler, might a security blanket. "Name's Albert. Assistant engineer," he stammered. "And you're very much not allowed in here." Felix raised a brow. "And yet, here I am. Funny how rules break so easily when someone's vanishing every other hour." Albert looked like he wanted to vanish himself. "It's supposed to generate energy. Cleanly, efficiently. But something's gone wrong. We didn't mean to turn passengers into soot and shadows." Felix interrupted, circling the machine like it might speak if he just looked at it hard enough. "We've seen steam trails, soot stains, no bodies. This thing, it's not just misfiring, is it? It's feeding." Albert turned pale. "It wasn't supposed to do that. We were testing boundaries, just theoretical ones, trying to tap into parallel." His voice trailed off. "Parallel what?" Felix demanded. "Worlds? Dimensions? Souls?" Albert only stared. The machine pulsed again, brighter this time. Something low and growling echoed through the pipes. Felix stepped back, suddenly aware that the air in the room had grown heavier, like the machine was aware of them now, listening. "Congratulations," Felix muttered. "You didn't build a generator. You built a doorway." Somewhere behind the brass coils, something moved. The silence aboard the train wasn't just quiet. It was the kind that settled into your bones, that made every creak of metal and puff of steam sound like a whisper from something hiding just out of sight. Detective Rayan Cross sat in his compartment, the dim glow of the overhead light casting long, twitching shadows across the walls. In his hand was a small note, crudely folded and slipped beneath his door when no one was watching. "Stay away from the machine, or you'll be next." Rayan smirked and tucked the note into the inside pocket of his coat. Finally, he murmured to himself, "Someone remembers to send the detective a proper warning." Outside, the train hissed and groaned like a restless creature. Most passengers were either asleep or pretending to be, hoping the nightmares would pass them over if they lay still enough. But Rayan, who had peeled back more secrets than he could count, was not about to let this one ride away into the night. He slipped into the corridor, producing a vintage hairpin he once found in the bathroom of a haunted cafe, and used it to pick the lock of the restricted carriage. With a soft click, the door eased open, revealing a space that looked less like part of a luxury train, and more like a portal into some madman's laboratory. Cables snaked across the floor like veins, gauges flickered with fluctuating pressure, and in the center stood the machine, an intricate tangle of brass pipes, humming coils, and a pulsing blue core that glowed like the heartbeat of something alive and watching. Rayan crouched beside the core, his eyes narrowing. The light was hypnotic. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw something. The faint imprint of a hand pressing from the inside of the glass. A cold shiver crawled up his spine. "Nope," he muttered, straightening up quickly. "Nope, nope, and absolutely not." Behind him, a throat cleared. Rayan turned to see a man, slight, pale, and holding a wrench like a priest clutches a cross. "Should I say something, or will you just guess?" the man said nervously. "Let me guess, you're the assistant engineer?" Rayan asked. The man nodded. "Albert." Rayan gave him a crooked smile. "Well, Albert, you've got yourself one hell of a toy here." Albert's face turned even paler. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he whispered. "It's not working right. Some of us want to shut it down. But the investors, the ones funding all this, they won't let us." Rayan stepped closer. "Because they think it's the future, right? Powering cities, unlimited wealth." Albert nodded slowly. "But it's doing something else. Something wrong. It's tearing at things, at reality." Rayan raised an eyebrow. "Side effects, huh? Like vaporizing passengers and leaving steamy handprints behind." Albert didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His face did all the talking. Promising he wouldn't touch anything, Rayan turned to leave. As he walked down the corridor, he paused just outside the smoking car. Low voices filtered through the slightly ajar door. "The machine is functioning exactly as planned," one voice said firmly. "Don't be absurd," another snapped. "It's unstable. We've already lost 3 people." Rayan leaned closer, holding his breath. "That's irrelevant. The experiment must continue. No matter the cost." Rayan exhaled quietly, his expression twisting. "Perfect," he muttered. "They've officially reached the ignore the bodies stage." Back in his compartment, Rayan collapsed into his seat and ran a hand through his hair. "So let's see," he said to no one. "A machine that might be eating people, a handful of wealthy lunatics, pretending to be gods, and an assistant engineer one panic attack away from fainting." From the opposite seat, Mr. Whiskers, an angry stray cat Rayan had unintentionally adopted on a previous case, let out a low, irritated meow. "Exactly," Rayan nodded. "Completely normal." But beneath the sarcasm, he felt something was building. Something that hissed in the pipes, whispered in the flickering lights, and left nothing behind but steam and the faint imprint of a human hand. Rayan Cross was beginning to think that the Belford Express was less of a luxury train, and more of a fast-moving nightmare, with polished windows. By the time the third passenger vanished, the dining car felt like the set of a ghost story casting call. People whispered over their tea, jumped at their reflections, and treated their luggage like it might sprout legs and walk off. The theories flew: steam creatures, haunted rails, curses from ancient machinery. As Rayan passed a table, an older woman reached out and grabbed his coat. "Detective," she whispered, eyes wide. "I saw him. The phantom. He came out of the steam and floated down the corridor." Rayan halted. "Floated," she nodded furiously. "No footsteps. Just mist. And glowing eyes." Rayan sighed, rubbing his face. "Great. That'll be fun to remember. At 3 a.m. But deep down, the tension in his chest tightened. Because whatever was out there, it was no longer hiding. It was beginning to show itself. And if Rayan wasn't careful, he wouldn't just be investigating the next disappearance. He'd be it. This time, it was Mr. Lancaster, a self-assured businessman, who had boldly declared that ghosts were nothing but superstition, who vanished from his locked compartment, vanishing as though swallowed by the very air. Felix's eyes narrowed, as he stood in front of the empty compartment, where Lancaster had last been seen, an empty cigarette pack, and half-drunk glass of whiskey his only witnesses. Right, so the phantom floats, emerges from steam, and picks off passengers like it's shopping for a free meal. Felix muttered under his breath, pacing back and forth. Great. Ghosts on a train. Sure, why not? The trouble, however, was that there wasn't a single trace of anything. No broken locks, no footprints, no struggle, just soot, steam and an unsettling stillness hanging in the air. Guess I'll have to catch the phantom in the act, Felix added, cracking his knuckles with a slight smirk, though his patience had long since run thin. Determined, he stationed himself outside the first-class compartments at 11:30 p.m., leaning casually against the wall, and pretending to read a tattered newspaper. The minutes ticked by like hours, and just as his eyelids began to droop, the porter strolled by, eyeing him curiously. "You've been standing there for an hour, sir," the porter remarked, raising an eyebrow. Felix flashed a grin. "I enjoy walls. Very interesting things. Walls." The porter sighed, and continued walking, muttering under his breath. Felix returned to his vigil, his eyes now fixed on the far end of the corridor, where the experimental carriage hummed ominously, glowing faintly in the dim light. As the clock struck 11:57 p.m., a bone-chilling cold swept over the corridor, the air thickening with a strange pressure. Felix's breath puffed in front of him, and from beneath one of the compartment doors came a faint hiss, as though steam was leaking into the air. And then he saw it. No, felt it first. A shadowy figure slipping through the mist like a wraith. It emerged silently from the direction of the experimental carriage. "Well, would you look at that?" Felix muttered with a wry smile. "A ghost who clearly didn't get the memo that I don't believe in him." The figure drifted down the corridor, moving past Felix without even a glance. Felix took a deliberate step forward, his voice sharp with sarcasm. "Excuse me, sir. Got a ticket?" The figure paused for a split second, just long enough for Felix to get a better look, before evaporating into the air, as though it had never existed. Felix stood there, staring at the empty space, his mouth forming a silent curse. "Brilliant. Floating and rude. Perfect," he muttered to himself. But as he turned to head back, something caught his eye, a glint of brass reflecting the lantern light beneath his feet. He bent down, picking up the small object, a brass gear, strangely shaped with sharp edges and faint markings that seemed to match the intricate designs he had seen on the experimental machine. Felix turned the gear over in his hand, his brow furrowing as an unsettling feeling crept over him. This isn't supposed to fall off, he murmured. A growing suspicion gnawed at him. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a simple piece of malfunctioning machinery. It was something else, something more sinister. Without wasting another second, Felix marched straight to Albert's compartment, pounding on the door with more force than necessary. Albert opened it slowly, his face pale, eyes bloodshot, and a cup of tea clutched in his hand like it was a lifeline. "It's midnight," Albert groaned. "What do you want?" Felix didn't say a word, simply tossing the gear into Albert's trembling hand. "Congratulations, Albert. I think your little science project is falling apart." Albert's expression went from tired confusion to outright shock as he examined the gear, his face draining of color. "Where did you—" He trailed off, clearly horrified. "Oh, you know," Felix replied, deadpan. "Just picked it up after the floating steam ghost decided to stop by." Albert stared at him, the gears in his mind clearly whirring. He was questioning every life choice that had led him to this moment, and Felix could see it in his wide, blinking eyes. "What is this thing really?" Felix crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Albert opened his mouth, clearly about to speak, but then snapped it shut, his hesitation thick in the air. Felix stepped forward, his posture stiff with barely contained frustration. "I like my body in one piece, Albert," he said, his voice laced with an edge of warning. "So whatever that machine is doing, you'd better spill it now before this whole train turns into a haunted theme park." Albert's face turned an ashen shade as he nervously clasped his hands around the edge of the table. "It's supposed to, well, theoretically, generate energy by manipulating matter," he stammered, the weight of his words seeming to physically crush him. "But there have been unintended consequences." Felix stared at him unmoving, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Unintended consequences. Albert, 3 people are missing. This is no side effect. This is a malfunction, one that's getting people killed." Albert shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting from the gear in Felix's hand to the walls, as if the truth might materialize from the shadows and consume him whole. "I need to check the machine. If parts are falling off it, it could get dangerous." Felix's gaze hardened, his frustration giving way to cold resolve. "Yeah, I've picked up on the danger part. Let's move before someone else gets a permanent steam bath." The urgency in Felix's voice made Albert move quicker, and the two of them hurried down the narrow corridor. As they moved, the faint hum of the experimental machine vibrated through the walls, its eerie presence palpable in the oppressive silence. Felix's instincts were screaming at him, but the feeling of being watched, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up, had him second-guessing everything. The phantom, it seemed, was never far behind, but the deeper they went, the stronger Felix's suspicion grew that this wasn't just a simple case of malfunctioning equipment. No, something darker was at play here. As the night stretched on, Felix's hunches sharpened. By morning 2 passengers were gone, leaving an atmosphere thick with tension. The third-class carriages buzzed with terrified whispers, and Felix found his suspicion growing with every new face that passed him by. On this train, practically everyone looked like a suspect. With his eyes darting around, he marched straight for the engine room, knocking once before stepping in without waiting for permission. Inside, the head engineer, a burly man with arms like tree trunks and a mustache that could have had its own postal code, looked up from his work, clearly annoyed. "Detective," he muttered, his voice deep and gruff. "What can I do for you?" Felix didn't waste time. He held up the brass gear. "I believe this fell off your doom machine." The engineer's frown deepened as he took the gear in his thick hands, his fingers briefly caressing the brass, like it held some secret only he could unlock. "Not possible," he muttered, inspecting it closely. The machine sealed tight. This must have come from somewhere else. Felix crossed his arms, his patience thinning. "You mean the other giant glowing machine that isn't on this train?" The engineer sighed, his face sagging with a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. "All right, he finally admitted, his shoulders slumping. The device has been temperamental. Felix raised an eyebrow, his gaze narrowing. Temperamental, Albert called it mildly. I'd say it's more like reality bending. The engineer dismissed the comment with a wave, his tone dismissive. It's harmless. Besides, it's got nothing to do with the disappearances. Felix leaned in, his voice steady but sharp. 3 people are gone. There's a floating soot monster terrorizing the place. And you're telling me the glowing machine humming ominously has nothing to do with it? The engineer faltered for a moment, his confidence crumbling. Exactly, he said weakly, his voice shaky as though his own words were betraying him. Felix didn't let it slide. Incredible. I'll be sure to note your confidence in the official lies report. But before he could press further, the train conductor swept into the room, his presence commanding attention as if he owned the entire train. Detective Arkwright. The conductor began, his voice firm and authoritative. I need you to stop meddling in things you don't understand. Felix didn't even flinch. He simply looked the conductor up and down with a bored expression. Oh, I understand plenty. People are disappearing, unhelpful men with mustaches are in denial. And I haven't even had my breakfast yet. The conductor's frown deepened, his hands on his hips as if he were about to lecture Felix like a child. Leave the investigation to the authorities when we reach the next station, he said, his tone final, as though the matter was settled. Felix leaned back against the wall, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. Sure thing, I'll just sit back and let the phantom steam assassin keep doing his thing. No rush. The conductor's eye twitched as Felix exited the engine room, and his gaze shifted towards a tall, nervous man loitering just outside the restricted carriage. The man's hat was pulled low over his face, but he seemed to be trying a bit too hard to look uninterested, like someone who had been caught in the act of doing something far less innocent than admiring the train's design. Felix narrowed his eyes, sensing trouble. All right, buddy. What are you up to? The man jumped like he'd been caught trying to sneak a whole cake out of a bakery, his hand jerking awkwardly as he stammered. Just admiring the craftsmanship of the train. Felix shot him a piercing look, taking in the suspicious posture. Craftsmanship. Felix's voice dripped with disbelief. You mean the off-limits carriage with armed guards standing watch? The man laughed nervously, trying to cover up his discomfort. Is it off-limits? I had no idea, he replied, his voice faltering. Felix tilted his head, his suspicion growing sharper. What's your name? Ah, Jonathan, the man muttered, his eyes shifting. Felix raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. You're sure about that? Definitely, Jonathan stammered. Felix crossed his arms and gave him a hard stare. Right, well Jonathan, you're coming with me. Without another word, Felix marched the nervous man straight to the dining car and shoved him into a seat. A constable stood guard nearby, watching the man closely. Keep an eye on him, Felix instructed, his voice cold. He's got I might commit train crimes written all over him. Jonathan slumped in the chair, muttering under his breath about injustice and how he was just a simple train enthusiast. Felix didn't pay him much attention as he turned to leave, feeling the weight of the case inching closer to its resolution. The Belford Express pulled into the next station, and Felix handed Jonathan over to the local authorities with a smug grin plastered on his face, feeling the rush of victory. Here's your culprit, Felix declared, his voice laced with satisfaction. Caught him snooping near the device carriage. The constables nodded and dragged Jonathan off the train, despite his loud protests. I swear I'm just a train enthusiast, he shouted, but no one listened. Felix dusted his hands off and leaned back, content with his success. No more floating ghosts, no more vanishing passengers. Everything's back to normal. He returned to his compartment, his stomach growling in anticipation. The sandwich he'd been deprived of for 2 days was finally in his hands. He took one bite, savoring it. But just as he was about to take another, the unmistakable scream echoed down the corridor. Felix groaned, chewing reluctantly, and then pushed himself to his feet. By the time he reached the source of the noise, a crowd had already gathered in front of compartment 14. The porter was fumbling with the keys, clearly struggling to unlock the door. "Is it always locked?" Felix muttered under his breath, rubbing his forehead. The door swung open with a creak, revealing an eerie silence. Inside, the compartment was empty, except for a single clock hand, sitting neatly on the seat. Felix bent down, his fingers brushing the soot that smeared across the cold metal. A heavy sigh escaped him as he stood up, twirling the clock hand in his fingers, his mind racing. "Right," he muttered. "I suppose Jonathan wasn't the floating steam ghost after all." A gasp rang out from one of the nearby passengers. "Does this mean the Phantom is still on board?" Felix's lips curled into a dark grin as he stuffed the clock hand into his pocket. "Oh, absolutely," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "And I'd wager he's just getting started." A thought crossed his mind as he eyed the door. "One step at a time, Felix. One step at a time." Felix had 2 rules in life. 1. Never trust a sandwich with questionable meat. And 2. If mysterious figures start appearing out of steam, it's time to stop asking questions and start punching. Tonight, he was counting on the second rule. Felix sat slouched on a bench just outside the restricted carriage, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, pretending to nap. His mind, however, was far from resting. The plan was simple enough: lurk near the ominous glowing machine, waiting for the Phantom to make its midnight appearance, as it always did. He'd already gone through the motions of arresting a few suspects, but none of them had turned out to be the elusive culprit. So, a stakeout by the machine was the most straightforward option left. Nothing quite like a ghost stakeout to wrap up a long, exhausting day. Felix muttered bitterly, tipping his hat further down over his eyes, hiding his gaze from the rest of the world. The train rumbled steadily along the tracks, its wheels clattering in a rhythmic lull that did little to calm the building tension in Felix's chest. He'd arrested one innocent passenger without a second thought, and was beginning to question the soundness of his own methods. The disappearances were continuing, and Felix was no closer to solving the mystery than when he first boarded the Belford Express. If this trend kept up, he might start detaining people just for looking too comfortable in their seats or reading suspiciously. Felix sighed and glanced around at the dimly lit corridor, the shadows creeping along the edges of the floorboards. He muttered under his breath, trying to shake off his frustration. "It's too late for that." He glanced at his pocket watch. 12:02 a.m. He was just about to start doubting if he would even catch a glimpse of the ghost when suddenly, at 12:03 a.m., the train jerked to an abrupt halt, slamming the brakes as though the engine itself was panicked. Felix was thrown forward, his body slamming into the back of a nearby seat with a sickening thud. His face narrowly missed a coat rack, and luggage tumbled from overhead storage compartments, crashing to the floor. A scream echoed down the hall as panic set in. "Lovely," Felix grunted, gritting his teeth, still struggling to steady himself against the sudden chaos. But as the passengers scrambled, something far more unsettling caught Felix's attention. A cloaked figure appeared at the far end of the hall, standing as still and ominous as the dark shadow it cast. Felix's stomach dropped as the figure seemed to materialize out of nowhere, the fabric of the cloak flowing like smoke in the dim light. His heart raced, his breath quickening. Not this guy again. Felix squinted, focusing on the figure as it began to glide down the corridor toward him. It moved with a chilling sense of certainty and malevolence, as though it had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. The energy surrounding it screamed villain, like something straight out of a nightmare, and Felix's instincts kicked into overdrive. He braced himself. "Right," Felix muttered, his voice tight with the tension of the moment. "Time to follow rule number 2. His fingers curled into fists, and with a swift motion he lunged forward, prepared to tackle the specter. But just as his hands reached out, the world seemed to twist. The figure evaded his grasp effortlessly, as if it was part of the mist. Felix crashed forward into thin air, his body feeling weightless before slamming into the cold metal of the train's wall. His body protested against the impact, and in the blink of an eye, the figure vanished through the locked engine room door, disappearing without a trace. Felix stumbled forward, dizzy, his vision blurring as his legs gave way beneath him. His mind raced. Where did it go? What was that thing? But before he could recover, the entire corridor seemed to spin around him. And then everything went black. The last thing he saw was the gleam of the steel door locking in place, mocking him with its finality. The next thing Felix knew, he was being slapped awake. His eyes fluttered open, his head pounding, and he groaned as he blinked against the harsh light. It was Albert, the nervy assistant engineer, looking more terrified than usual. "Detective, wake up," Albert hissed, giving him another slap for good measure. Felix grumbled, still dazed. "Stop treating my face like a drum," he muttered groggily, rubbing his cheek as he slowly sat up. His mind swam with confusion. His body felt sore, and everything seemed to have happened so quickly. Albert was hovering over him with wide eyes, the panic clear on his face. "What happened?" Felix asked, still trying to gather his bearings. His head throbbed, and somewhere deep in the haze of his thoughts, his detective instincts whispered a warning. "You probably should have ducked." Felix blinked, his gaze falling to the wall behind him, where something caught his attention. There, etched into the wood in long, jagged letters, was a message. His blood ran cold as his eyes traced the words that seemed to burn into the wall with an unnatural, haunting energy. "You can't stop what's already begun." Felix's frown deepened as he read the cryptic message again. He rubbed the back of his neck, his mind working furiously. "That's unsettling, and unnecessarily dramatic," he muttered to himself. But his voice faltered as a chill ran down his spine. Albert, still jittery, glanced between Felix and the eerie words on the wall. His eyes were wide with fear, his voice a mere whisper. "Who did this?" His fear was palpable. Felix didn't answer immediately. He stared at the words, his mind racing with possibilities. There was no doubt in his mind now. The phantom wasn't just a ghost story or some random prank. This was a carefully orchestrated series of events, and it was only just beginning to unfold. Felix's head throbbed as he pushed himself up, groaning. He wiped a smear of blood off his lip, and tried to shake off the dizzying effects of his collision with the floor. "Ah, just your typical train ghost with a penchant for graffiti," he muttered, the sarcasm barely hiding the frustration and bewilderment. Albert, however, did not share his dark humor. The assistant engineer's nervous gaze darted around as if waiting for another disaster to drop from the rafters. Felix could feel his unease, and it only added to the gnawing sensation of something far worse than a ghost lurking just out of sight. Right. But Felix, there's another problem," Albert said, his voice cracking. Felix froze, his heart skipping a beat. "Bigger than a ghost attack?" he asked, the question leaving his lips with an edge of incredulity, even though he suspected that in his world, anything could be worse. Albert hesitated, clearly struggling to articulate what he was about to say. His voice dropped to a near whisper, as if sharing it aloud would make it real. "The train, it's speeding up, and we can't stop it." Felix blinked, stunned by the statement. His mind raced to connect the dots, but none of them made sense. "Wait, what?" he repeated, hoping the absurdity of the situation would make itself clear if he just heard the words again. "The train, it's speeding up on its own." His eyes locked onto Albert, who was shaking now, his hands trembling at his sides. Felix turned to glance out the window, as though hoping the steady rhythmic motion of the tracks would reassure him. But no, nothing was normal. The train was barreling forward at an unnatural speed. Felix let out a low, incredulous laugh. "So not only do we have a ghost assassin on board, but now we've got a runaway train. Are we in some kind of horror comedy crossover?" His words hung in the air, the bitter taste of disbelief still fresh in his mouth. But Albert's face wasn't smiling. "The device, it's somehow feeding into the engine. It's accelerating uncontrollably," Albert continued, his voice strained, as if he didn't believe what he was saying either, but had no other explanation. Felix pinched the bridge of his nose, his patience slipping away. "You're telling me this train is driven by a ghost-powered machine?" And no one thought to, I don't know, warn someone? He let out a frustrated sigh, his hand dropping to his side as he fought to keep his rising panic in check. This was quickly escalating beyond anything he'd ever dealt with. And to make matters worse, now this device is feeding into the engine, making us go faster? Fantastic. His voice dripped with sarcasm as his mind spun with all the ways this could end. None of them good. Albert nodded slowly, the gravity of the situation finally sinking in. Felix shook his head in disbelief, still unable to wrap his mind around the chaos unfolding before him. Great. I always wanted my obituary to read, punctured by a ghost, died on a runaway train. The dry humor was his defense mechanism. When everything around him was falling apart, humor was the only thing that kept him from losing it completely. All right, Albert. Let's figure this out before we both end up in the afterlife. And the train does too, Felix said, pushing forward. Albert, pale and sweating, hesitated. You're going into the engine room? After what happened? Felix met his gaze with steely resolve. Oh, absolutely. Someone needs to tell this ghost to stop with the punches and start reading a manual on train safety. Felix smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. He wasn't sure what was worse, the ghost, the runaway train, or the fact that he was now in charge of handling both. With his resolve steeling, Felix and Albert made their way to the engine room. As they neared the door, steam hissed from the cracks like an angry serpent, the sound echoing throughout the narrow hall. Felix glanced at Albert, his expression unreadable. How confident are you that this thing won't explode the second I open that door? Albert's voice trembled slightly as he shrugged. About 20%. Felix rolled his eyes. Fantastic. Just the odds I was hoping for. Without another word, Felix grabbed the handle and yanked the door open. The noise that met them was deafening, steam pouring out in waves, fogging the space. Inside, the engine room was nothing short of chaotic. The experimental device at the center of the room glowed with a cold, unnatural blue light, its power surging out of control. Gears spun erratically, clashing together with terrifying speed. The whole room trembled, the train's increasing velocity causing the floor to vibrate violently. Felix steadied himself against the frame of the door, his heart pounding in his chest as the overwhelming sight of the device filled his vision. Every movement seemed like it could send the train plummeting into the unknown. In the midst of the bedlam stood the head engineer. His sleeves were rolled up, his face drenched in sweat, and his eyes wide with panic. Felix's gaze locked onto him. All right, you're going to explain all of this before I start pulling things out at random. No one's getting out of here alive unless you talk. The engineer wiped his brow with a rag, and with a deep, weary sigh, he met Felix's eyes. You wouldn't understand, detective. It's complicated. Felix's eyes narrowed. Try me. I once solved a case involving a duck, a stolen diamond, and a very angry butler. So trust me when I say my bar for complicated is very high. The engineer hesitated, but before he could speak, the train lurched forward violently, throwing everyone off balance. Felix's feet slid against the floor, but he quickly regained his footing, determined not to let this chaos consume him. His instincts were already firing. This wasn't just a runaway train. This was something else, something much darker, and it had to be stopped before it was too late. General sighed deeply, his gaze darting to the enigmatic device before him. Felix, he muttered, turning slowly, his eyes narrowed. This isn't just about generating energy, is it? The engineer's expression shifted to one of unease. What do you mean? Felix questioned. I thought it was for teleportation. Albert's voice trembled as he spoke, still grappling with the impossible situation. The machine, he blurted. It's supposed to move objects instantly, but we never accounted for minds. His words trailed off, a cold shiver crawling down his spine. Felix blinked, trying to grasp the magnitude of what was being said. Teleportation. On a train. He shook his head in disbelief. What were you hoping to achieve? Beam people to their destinations, bypassing the tracks entirely. Something like that. the engineer replied, pinching the bridge of his nose, the weight of their predicament sinking in. Let me guess, Felix said, his voice sharp. The reason people are vanishing is because they're getting teleported into oblivion, right? The engineer's head shook slowly. No, he said, his tone darkening. Not oblivion. Someone's been controlling it. As if on cue, the air in the room seemed to thicken, and from behind the machine, a tall, imposing figure emerged. His silhouette was framed by the harsh light of the machinery, the smug smile on his face revealing the kind of confidence only a man with power could carry. Ah, Mr. Thornton, Felix muttered, his suspicion turning to certainty. I should have known. Thornton, one of the wealthiest industrialists aboard the train, stood tall in a designer suit that screamed excess. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous self-assuredness as he regarded Felix with thinly veiled amusement. Detective Arkwright, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. I had wondered how long it would take you to figure it out. Felix's lips curled into a grim smile. You're the one responsible for the floating steam ghost sightings, aren't you? Thornton chuckled lightly, waving a dismissive hand. Please, I've merely been using the machine to move around the train. I can see how that might have unsettled a few of your passengers, though. Albert stood frozen, his mouth dry. But why? He asked, the confusion in his voice giving way to a growing sense of dread. Thornton straightened his tie with a practiced flick of his wrist, his eyes narrowing. Simple, he said coldly. My rivals were on board. This device, it gave me a way to eliminate them without a trace. Felix groaned under his breath. Ah, the classic rich guy. Eliminate the competition with an illegal science project. Couldn't just stick to the stock market like everyone else, huh? Thornton's gaze flickered with something dark, almost predatory. Where's the fun in that? Before either of them could say anything more, the train jerked violently. The hum of the device shifted into a deep guttural growl, the kind of sound that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Albert's face drained of color. I think. His voice faltered as his eyes widened in horror. I think the machine is about to tear itself apart. Felix's expression darkened, and he immediately rolled up his sleeves, his mind already in motion. Great, he muttered, cracking his knuckles. I love preventing explosions while fighting crime. Thornton lunged toward the controls, desperately twisting knobs and yanking levers. I can still fix it, he shouted over the din. Felix's eyes flashed, and in an instant he grabbed Thornton by the collar, yanking him away with a swift motion. No, he snapped. You're done playing train conductor. A brief but intense scuffle broke out, Thornton flailing as he tried to break free, while Felix wrestled him with surprising ease, his movements calculated and precise. Meanwhile, Albert was frantically poking at the machine's controls, his fingers trembling. How do I turn it off? He yelled, panic creeping into his voice. Felix, mid-tackle, shouted over his shoulder, Don't touch anything that glows blue. Albert froze, his eyes widening as he saw the entire control panel bathed in an eerie blue light. It's all glowing blue, he cried, terror in his voice. Felix cursed under his breath, glancing around as Thornton nearly slipped from his grip. Then his gaze landed on a large, ominous red lever at the far end of the machine. Felix's eyes gleamed with determination. Oh, I love red levers, he muttered, grinning wickedly. Ignoring Thornton's protests, he lunged for the lever, yanking it down with all his might. The machine sputtered violently, sparks flying in every direction as it let out an agonized wheeze. For a moment, the train seemed to shudder under the strain, its speed plummeting rapidly. Albert, caught off guard by the sudden drop, staggered, barely managing to stay on his feet. Thornton, defeated, sagged against the machine, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. You ruined everything, he spat. Felix smirked, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. Good, he said. Now I can finally sleep tonight. By the time the train pulled into the next station, Thornton was handcuffed, A grim expression plastered across his face as the local authorities hauled him away. The constables and passengers erupted into loud applause, their cheers reverberating throughout the train, as though Felix had single-handedly fought off a dragon. "Thank you, Detective," someone called out from the crowd, their voice tinged with awe. Felix raised a hand in acknowledgement, waving lazily, though he wasn't one for basking in praise. "Take the credit," he muttered, his tone nonchalant. "Damn the day's work." Albert, still looking pale, and a little frazzled, approached him, a hesitant expression lingering on his face. "Detective," he began, voice trembling slightly. "The machine, it's gone." Felix turned, following Albert's pointing finger towards the engine room. His eyes scanned the space that had just moments before been the epicenter of chaos. Now all that remained were faint scorch marks on the walls, a silent testament to the disaster that had nearly occurred. Felix's frown deepened as he scratched his head, confusion swirling in his mind. "Well, that's suspicious," he murmured under his breath, his thoughts whirling. The train crew began cleaning up the mess, but Felix couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. The questions flooded his mind. Where had the machine gone? Had someone taken it? But the more he thought about it, the more one thing became glaringly clear. Felix Arkwright's days of dealing with rogue steam-powered teleportation devices were far from over. Felix wasn't one for self-praise, but in that moment, he allowed himself a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had saved the train from certain destruction, exposed a corrupt industrialist, and narrowly avoided being blown to bits by an experiment gone horribly wrong. When Scotland Yard presented him with a shiny medal and a lackluster handshake, he accepted both with the kind of grace that only someone who hadn't slept in 2 days could muster. "Well done, Arkwright," Inspector Hayes said, slapping him on the back with a smile. "You prevented a catastrophe." Felix smirked, his exhaustion now manifesting in the form of biting sarcasm. "Oh sure," he replied, with a dry laugh, "just your average Wednesday. Be sure to stop by next time your train tries to teleport into another dimension." Hayes raised an eyebrow, not sure if he should be amused or concerned. "Was that sarcasm?" he asked, half smiling. Felix nodded, his voice dripping with irony. Yes, that was definitely sarcasm." Felix's prediction proved true. Within hours the wealthy industrialists who had been behind the ghost train project dissolved their partnership. "Best not to meddle in things we don't understand," one of them nervously muttered, his face still pale from the ordeal. Felix couldn't help but snort in amusement. "That's exactly what I said," he replied, with a wry grin, "before one of you tried to evaporate your business partners again." The industrialists, looking thoroughly embarrassed, promised to abandon dangerous scientific ventures, and instead focus on safer pursuits like opening more high-end hat shops. Felix gave them about a week before one of them accidentally invented a death-ray toaster. Several days later, Felix found himself back aboard the Belford Express, the quiet hum of the train the only sound breaking the stillness of the engine room. The machine, the one that had caused so much chaos, the glowing lights, the humming energy, the eerie presence that had filled the air, was gone. The room, once alive with tension and danger, now stood silent. Felix walked through the space slowly, as though waiting for something to reveal itself. The absence of the machine only deepened the mystery. Had it truly disappeared? Or was it simply hidden away, waiting for the right moment to resurface? The silence, in a way, was even more unsettling than the chaos that had unfolded. Felix paused, his eyes scanning the empty room as his mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that something far more dangerous than a teleporting industrialist was at play here. The machine was not just a tool for teleportation. It had been something more, something far darker. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. But Felix knew one thing for certain. The real mystery wasn't over, and whatever had been set into motion here was far from finished. With a sigh, Felix ran a hand through his hair, his exhaustion pressing down on him like a weight. But there was no time to rest. The shadows had only deepened, and Felix Arkwright was certain that this was just the beginning of something far more twisted. He turned and made his way down the darkened corridor of the train, his footsteps echoing ominously in the now silent car. There was no escaping the feeling that he was being drawn into a much larger web of secrets, secrets that would take more than a simple detective's wit to unravel. The gears, the glowing lights, the soft hum of the machine, all of it was gone. In its place, the engine room was nothing more than a scorched wasteland. Charred wood was splintered into jagged shards. Shattered gauges lay strewn about like forgotten relics, and a thick, suffocating smell of burnt metal and scorched nonsense filled the air, clinging to the walls, the floors, and Felix's lungs. It was as though the room had been consumed by an invisible fire, one that had left nothing in its wake but destruction. Felix crouched in the center of the wreckage, his fingers brushing through the fine layer of ash that covered the ground, searching for some sign of what had once been there. His eyes scanned the ruins, but there was no trace of the machine, no trace of the strange ethereal teleportation device that had nearly torn the train apart just moments ago. He shook his head, muttering to himself in disbelief. "Nothing left," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. Beside him, Mr. Whiskers, who had somehow managed to follow him onto the train in the chaos, meowed softly from the corner. Felix looked over at the cat, scratching his head with a sigh. "Yeah, I know. If I'd saved the machine, we could have teleported straight to the fish market. Real missed opportunity," he said with a dry chuckle, though the humor in his voice was laced with an undercurrent of unease. He straightened up, ready to leave, but something glimmered in the corner of his eye. Something small, metallic, half buried in the soot and grime. His eyes narrowed, and he crouched again, his fingers gently brushing away the ashes to reveal a small ticking gear. But this wasn't just any gear. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its edges were slightly worn, and its surface was etched with strange markings that seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm. As Felix picked it up, the faint ticking sound grew louder, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. It was almost as though the gear was alive, its mechanical heartbeat a whisper of something far darker than just a broken machine. Felix stared at it, his eyes narrowing further. "Well, that's not suspicious at all," he muttered under his breath, rolling the gear between his fingers. It pulsed faintly, like a living creature, its mechanical clicking filling the silence of the ruined room. He could almost feel the tension in the air thickening with each beat, the weight of something dangerous lurking beneath the surface. Satisfied that the device wasn't about to explode in his hand, Felix tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat, a grim sense of foreboding creeping into his chest. Whatever this was, it was far from over. As he turned to leave, the faintest hiss echoed through the room, cutting through the silence like a sharp knife. Felix froze, every muscle in his body locking into place. His heart skipped a beat as he scanned the empty room, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Nothing moved. The room was still, but then, from the far corner, a faint puff of steam curled up into the air, almost as though it were a breath escaping from something unseen. Felix tilted his head, his gaze fixating on the spot. "All right, who's still here?" he called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. But there was no reply, just the deafening silence that seemed to settle over everything. Mr. Whiskers, unfazed by the strange happenings, flicked his tail and gave a short, annoyed meow. Felix raised an eyebrow. "Leaky pipes," he muttered, his tone dismissive, trying to convince himself that it was just the machinery of the train malfunctioning. But as he reached for the door, about to step out of the room, a soft, barely audible whisper filled the air. It wasn't a noise that could have come from any living being. It was too faint, too chilling. "You can't stop what's already begun." The words seemed to hang in the air, echoing around the room, lingering in Felix's mind. He froze mid-step, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. A cold sweat trickled down his spine as the whisper reverberated in his skull, an unshakable feeling of dread settling over him. He sighed heavily, exhaling a long, dramatic breath. "Oh, come on," he muttered, tugging his hat lower over his eyes, trying to block out the oppressive sense of unease that had taken root in his chest. I just fixed this mess. But it was no use. The words, the warning, had already gotten under his skin, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. He cast one final glance at the destroyed engine room, the wreckage of the machine still smoking faintly in the corner. Shaking his head, he turned away, forcing himself to move forward. There was no use dwelling on it now. No use trying to figure out what had happened. Not yet. Mr. Whiskers trotted along beside him, blissfully unaware of the dark forces that seemed to be stirring within the heart of the Belford Express. The train rumbled quietly as it began to pull out of the station, its engine growling softly beneath the dim, flickering lights of the corridor. But Felix had an unsettling feeling gnawing at him. Something was wrong. He couldn't quite place it, but the air felt thick with something unknown, something dangerous. He hadn't seen the last of whatever had gone wrong with that machine, nor had he seen the last of the mysterious force that seemed to be haunting the train. The floating steam assassin, the whispers, the gear, everything was connected, and Felix could feel the weight of it all, heavy on his chest. As the train moved further into the night, the darkness outside pressing in, Felix knew this was only the beginning of something far worse. His journey was far from over. The steam-powered mysteries of the Belford Express had only just begun.